Well, I'm not sure what happened there. Sorry about that. We just spontaneously disconnected. Okay, so I was talking about tungsten light, I believe. Tungsten light, bulbs used in photo studios have a lower color temperature, somewhere in the 3200 Kelvin range. Into that category uh, are bulbs that uh, that are called incandescent bulbs, and they have lower color temperatures. So the older style Edison type light bulbs um, fall into this category, incandescent. So the light that they put out has more gold or orange in them. Pardon me. Below 3200 Kelvin, getting to be very reddish light, is 1900 Kelvin, and that is candle light. So you know candles put out a very orangey red sort of light. And below that is very, very dark red light, so around 900, 1000 to 900 Kelvin. Lava just before it cools enough so that you can't see it glowing anymore. Uh, and then the black body goes black. So these are the these are the color temperatures that we deal with in photography. Again, the higher the color temperature, the more blue the light. The lower the color temperature, the more red. And it's just another way of describing colors. So instead of saying that a color has a certain wavelength of, in nanometers, uh, we, of course, ascribe them names. But scientifically, they're also referred to in the Kelvin scale of color temperature. Um, so I want to talk about that somewhat more in somewhat more detail. So as I said, our brains compensate for many, many things, uh, including changes in the types of light we are experiencing. So outside, we experience daylight, we experience shade, we experience cloud cover. Indoors, there are different types of lights. Fluorescent, the fluorescent bulbs, also the compact fluorescents that are kind of spirally. Incandescent light, as I mentioned, so tungsten slash incandescent light, which are generally the types of bulbs that we use indoors. And all of these types of lights have different color temperatures. Um, Films, so color films, are designed for the most part to be used under daylight. And if you look at a roll of film that comes in a canister, it will say on it daylight somewhere. And it will say probably 5000 Kelvin or 5500 Kelvin, indicating the color temperature under which that film is designed to be used. If you do not use it under or in that situation, then you will get a color cast. That means that the entire image has this color cast. And so the most commonly seen color cast is the color cast you get when shooting a daylight balanced film inside under incandescent light, and that's an orange color cast. Um, when you photograph under fluorescent light, you get a kind of yellowish green or greenish yellow color cast. Under cloud and shade, you get blue color casts. With digital photography, obviously we're not using film, but digital sensors are also sensitive to these different color types, or I should say, they're designed to be used under specific types of light. And you can also get different color casts depending on how you set your camera. And so I've listed these color casts here that one gets. In digital photography, we can change settings. The settings are called the white balance settings, so that we do not get color casts. In the past, with film, we couldn't change a setting because we're using film, and so external filters had to be used to correct for these color casts. So I want to talk about these filters just for a little bit to give you an idea of, sorry, one moment, to give you an idea of what happens when we, in digital photography, change the white balance settings. So filters come in two types, physically two types. Sorry, I'm not sure that this is still sharing the screen. There we go. Filters that screw onto the end of the outer element of the lens, and then filters that are gels, that are like 3 or 4 inch square gels, and those you buy a bracket for that you put on the end of the lens, and then you can swap those out. Most people these days use the kind that screw right onto the end of the lens. The most commonly used filters at this point are called not neutral density, sorry, UV haze filters, UV for ultraviolet. And these filters are used not so much to block ultraviolet radiation, which they do, but to protect the outer element of the lens. So lenses are expensive. Filters are relatively inexpensive. So if you damage the outer element of your lens can be ruined. Getting gunk all over it, scratches, dropping the camera, all of those things can pretty easily damage the lens. So having a protective filter over it is a good idea. There are many other types of filters, special effects filters, filters that give you rainbows or starbursts, diffusing filters, soft focus filters. So those are not the ones that I'm talking about here. And of course, you're welcome to fool around and try out any number of filters or whatever you want to try out. But here I'm talking about some specific types of filters. And so the first type, the first group of filters is called color conversion filters. And these are the big guns of the filter world. They're more intense filters and used not really for tweaking, like if you think your image is a little too one color or another. These are not the filters you'd use. These are the filters that are used when you're photographing under the wrong lighting situation for the film that you happen to have. So these are the filters that are used to really correct for these color casts that I'll show you images of in a few minutes. So to correct for that orange color cast that is created by using a daylight balance film or sensor setting under incandescent or tungsten light, we use a blue filter, number 80 blue filter. And blue neutralizes orange. So it should bring the image into the daylight range. The opposite of that is the 85 orange filter. And so if you happen to be using, which was not as usual, but a tungsten bounce film, or happen to have your digital sensor set for indoor light, incandescent or tungsten light, you would get an excessively blue color cast shooting that under daylight. And so an orange, number 85 orange filter is used to neutralize that blue color cast. So those are the more intense, excuse me, filters. Sorry, this is coming up. After that are light balancing filters. And the light balancing filters aren't quite as intense. So if you feel your image is a little bit too blue or a little bit too orangey, you would use one of these filters. The 81 filters are pale to medium amber, so not quite orange. Used when you feel your image is a little bit too bluish. And the number 82 filters, pale to medium blue, used if you feel your image is just a little bit too orangey. And then fluorescent filters. Fluorescent light can be really, really ghastly. And the fluorescent color cast, the yellowish green color cast, can be so intense that even our wonderful brains can't completely compensate for that. And it can be pretty noticeable that when we're under fluorescent light, everything looks kind of icky, you know. This sort of, again, a yellowish green or greenish yellow cast, people look kind of corpse-like under this light. It's really not very flattering. So to compensate for that color cast, we use a magenta, kind of pinkish purple filter called an FLD filter, FL for fluorescent, D for daylight. Excuse me. Fluorescent light is a little more difficult to correct for because it doesn't put out just one color or one wavelength or color temperature the way incandescent lights do. Fluorescent lights put out light across several of the colors, green, blue, into the violet range. However, the FLD filters are certainly better than nothing. So they do compensate or correct for that yellow-green color cast pretty well. So again, these filters are what we use when we're using film. Happily, in digital photography, we don't have to do that. We can change something called the white balance. So I want to talk about that for a few moments, or more than a few moments, actually. Let's see here. So if you go to your camera and look at the back, probably, there will probably be a little button that says WB, and that stands for white balance. Or you can go into the menu and go to the white balance portion of the menu. And there should be a collection of words or icons, little pictures, or both. And these are the ones that you should see. So auto, and in the auto white balance setting, the camera kind of does its best to correct for color shifts that it sees. Then daylight, and in daylight, you may also, or alternatively see a sun, a little icon for sun. For incandescent, some of your cameras may say tungsten. You'll see a little icon of a light bulb. And that's roughly 3200 degrees Kelvin. Then fluorescent, and there should be a little icon of a fluorescent bulb that looks kind of more like a centipede often, or a millipede. Then cloudy, a little icon of a cloud at 7,000 Kelvin. Shade, there's usually a building casting shadow at 8,000 Kelvin. Flash, which is a lightning bolt. And then custom, and it may have the letter K for Kelvin. And in this setting, you can set a specific color temperature. And so when we change the white balance settings on the camera, it's kind of as if we are applying filters to correct for those color shifts or the color casts that we get in different lighting situations. So when we change our white balance setting from daylight to incandescent, it's as if we're applying a number 80 blue filter to compensate for that orange color cast that we get. When we change the the white balance to fluorescent, it's as if we're applying an FLD filter to correct for the yellow-green color cast. When we change the white balance to shade, it's as if we're applying a number 85 orange filter to correct for the blue color cast that we get in deep shade. Under cloudy, it's as if we're applying a light balancing filter, number 81 amber filter, to correct for the not quite as blue color cast that we get under cloud cover. Flash, in some ways, doesn't quite make as much sense because our flashes are balanced to daylight. But if you put the camera, the white balance, into the flash setting, you'll see a slight difference between that and just shooting with the white balance set to daylight. The flash setting will give you a little bit more gold in the image than without it. And then custom allows you to set a specific color temperature if you so desire. So obviously the camera doesn't have all these little filters built into it that it applies, but it writes, there are rules written, algorithms, that tell the sensor what to kind of filter for. And depending on the file type you're using, JPEG or RAW, actual changes will be made to the image and the file, or just the information about the color temperatures under which you're shooting will be recorded. So I'll talk about file types again in a little while, but it's something that you should be aware of, especially if you shoot in JPEG, because JPEG file types are what are called lossy file types. They toss information to save room on your memory cards. And so if you have set the digital camera to the wrong white balance setting, depending on the lighting situation under which you're photographing, that information gets stored and the other information is dumped. So the color temperature of the image is set. Whereas in raw images, if you're shooting in RAW, no information is actually dumped. That is all of the information, all of the data that were recorded at the time. And so even if you shoot in the wrong white balance setting when you're shooting RAW, it doesn't really matter because no changes have actually been made to that information, and no information has been dumped. But it is important if you shoot in JPEG. So I want us to look at a few images. Let me just bring them up, dealing with color temperature and white balance. Any questions or comments while I'm bringing this stuff up? No? Okay. And eventually this will open up, I hope. Or not. It's just kind of spinning. My apologies. Let me see if I can find this another way. Hmm. There we go. Hopefully. Can you see this painting here? Okay. Probably wondering why I'm showing you a painting in a photo class. Um, so this painting was made by an American painter named John Singer Sargent, and it's entitled Madam X, and it was painted in like the 1870s. And Madam X was a real person. She wasn't called Madam X, but she did exist. And Singer painted her, and the painting was poorly received at the time in Paris, and that was for two reasons, or two main reasons, I should say. And the first was that her gown was considered to be really risque. It looks as if it's about to pop off, or looked that way to people of the time. Even in Paris, which was relatively open and more liberal minded in terms of things physical and sexual than in England and the United States. The second thing that bugged people, I guess, is her skin color. And if you look at it, you can see it's kind of not just pallid white. It has subtly, it has blue and lilac tones in it. And people reacted negatively to this. And that's true in general of our emotional responses to images that are not necessarily conscious, but unconsciously, subconsciously, we tend to react more favorably to images that have more golds and reds and oranges than we do to images that have blues and greens and purples. Not that we don't like those colors. This is more an emotional response. And so the blues and purples in this woman's skin tones were off-putting to people uh, on a subconscious level. And she does look, well, abnormally pale, and perhaps as if she's been out in the cold way too long, compared to how skin tones generally appear. Let me just bring up one other. Okay, so um, can you guys see this blue image? Yes. This image was painted by the Spanish painter Pablo Picasso, and you can, during his blue period, as you can see, um, and it's very blue. And to me anyway, it shows that Picasso was really aware of color temperature in a way that most of us are not. And it's not that we wouldn't see this room as it is, so with very little direct light coming in. So it's not in complete darkness, but the light that's coming in is not direct sunlight. And it makes the room bluish, except for the few areas that you can see where light is coming in from the window, and those areas have some yellow and orange in them. But we don't usually process things this way. We don't consciously go into a room and say, oh, it's really blue. We'd notice that there isn't direct light, but we wouldn't perceive it immediately as blue. And Picasso did, and you can see that. And it's not that there are no other colors in this room, but everything has a blue color cast to it, except for the few areas that are actually being struck by sunlight or daylight. This image is the complete opposite. So I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the painter Thomas Kinkade. Some years ago, there were Thomas Kinkade studios all over in malls, in slightly fancier, though not totally upscale, shopping areas. And so he always had a trademark after his name, Thomas Kinkade, painter of light. And almost, to my knowledge anyway, all his paintings were similar to these in that they're almost always in these little hamlets or little villages. The time of day is twilight. The sun has just set or is just setting. All the lights have come on in houses. All the houses are these sort of gingerbread-like houses, with thatched roofs. They all have chimneys, or as you can see, multiple chimneys. All of the chimneys have smoke coming out of them. There's almost always a church in the scene, a body of water with some flowers. But the main thing that one sees is that every single light in every house is turned on. It's like a PG&E dream come true. And the light from all of those windows is this golden orange light. So that is the color cast that that we get in photographs when we're photographing inside under incandescent or tungsten light. And it tugs at us on a sort of primal level almost. It invites us in. It gives us this feeling of warmth and comfort and safety. And that is what these pictures, these paintings are designed to do on a subliminal level. They're designed to pull us in and make us feel as if we're coming home. We're going to safety, the warmth and the comfort and the safety of home. And that color temperature specifically really does that. And I think it's almost, at this point, it's built into us almost genetically, because for a million years or more, fire has meant safety for us. So this image is in some ways the opposite of this image, and certainly in terms of color temperature, it is. This image also is quite blue, although we don't necessarily, the first thing we think of when we look at this image is not necessarily that it's way too blue. We probably pay somewhat more attention to the subject matter, these two older men sitting on a bench, the cat there as well. But when we see it properly balanced in terms of the color temperature, then we're like, oh, wow, that is a huge difference from here to here. And so these are side by side. So again, often we don't notice the color cast that is present until we see it corrected for, or until we see a different color temperature presented in the same situation. This one, I think, on the left is so obvious that we couldn't help but notice. So the image on the left was made under the site I got it from says it was made under incandescent light. To me, it looks as if there's fluorescent there too. There's so much yellow in it and some green, and it's really unpleasing. It just doesn't look right, even without the corrected image on the right. And you can see there's a huge difference here when the white balance has been corrected. This is what happens, and we'll look at a couple of others. When you change the white balance setting and you don't need to. So if you're shooting under daylight, and that's daylight in the center, which actually has a little bit too much purple in it. But when you do that, let me find a better example. That's better. When you do that, then you get color cast as well. So the quote correct setting here is all the way to the right under daylight. And when you change the white balance setting on your camera in that situation, then you'll get these color casts because what you're doing by changing the white balance setting is telling the camera that you're photographing in a different lighting situation. So when you change the white balance from daylight to tungsten, for example, you are telling the camera that you're shooting in a situation that has a lot of red or orange in it, and that it needs to use blue to correct for that. Since that's not actually the case, the image will look blue because the camera thinks, oh gosh, there's so much red, I have to use blue, because you put it in the tungsten or incandescent setting. For fluorescent, it's not quite as obvious here, but you can see that there's purple in this image, especially if you look at the clouds. And so we said that the fluorescent filters are magenta, or purple essentially, to correct for that yellow-green color cast. And so we're telling the camera, by changing the setting to fluorescent, we're telling the camera that that there's all this yellow-green that needs to be corrected for, and if there isn't actually, then our image will look kind of purple. And so on with these others, cloudy and shade both would have a lot more blue. And so then under, if we change the white balance to cloudy or shade, we're telling the camera that there's a lot of blue light and the camera needs to add orange to correct for that. And since there actually isn't blue, an excess of blue light, these images have more orange in them than is necessary. In general, adding more orange or gold is somewhat more to taste. We may want a little more or less. Blues, however, are generally unacceptable. Almost no one wants an image that is totally blue, like the ones to the left. So that's something we definitely work on in Lightroom. That is correcting for color temperature. So here's another example, maybe somewhat better actually, of what happens when you change the white balance and you don't need to. Right. Okay, so here is a little diagram, I guess, of color temperature in the opposite direction. Is it? No, it's not. What am I saying? Uh, kind of the opposite direction of the way I talked about it, but in this case, going from a lower temperature to a higher temperature. Um, but the temperatures are essentially the, what I told you, right? And get out of this for one moment. Okay, so when you go into your white balance menu, uh, this should come up. Let me see if this one has a better. Harumph. Well, this will do. Okay, so sorry, when you go into the camera, you select white balance, and then you should see some kind of menu come up. Some have just the pictures or the icons, others have both. Sorry, that's the wrong one again. So again, auto, where the camera does what it thinks is probably correct, and then the specific lighting situations. And generally, using specific white balance settings will give you a more accurate representation than just leaving it in auto. Although, depending on the camera you have, auto can do a pretty good job. Yeah, okay, I think that's it. So in different lighting, can you guys see these images of this woman under different lighting situations? Yeah, okay. So to the far left, under sunlight or daylight, which can often give really harsh shadows, but again, there shouldn't be a color cast per se, because this is what films and the sensors are designed to photograph under, this type of light. Later in the day, so the second image from the left, sunlight at 5 p.m., you can see there's a little more yellow gold in the image. In the center image, open shade, it's purple, it's lilac colored. So there's no direct sun. And again, that light is very bluish, and in this case, almost purple. The second image from the right is under tungsten or incandescent light, and you can see that extremely orange color cast that that is produced when the setting, the white balance setting or the film, is a daylight setting, and then used under incandescent or tungsten light. And then finally, to the right, fluorescent light. And you can see that it is really yellowish green. It's really kind of ghastly. And the woman looks a bit like a zombie or a corpse. And it's really not flattering in any in the standards of portrait photography. So it's not that people never shoot like this and leave the color cast. Some people do. Some people like that ghastly corpse-like effect that fluorescent light gives, and they don't correct for it. Or the orangey light under tungsten light, the orange color cast. There's some well-known photographers who really like to use that and like what it conveys in a way. So how you shoot will affect, obviously, how we as the observers experience the images. So along with all the other things you have to think about when you're making your images, uh, you need to think about color temperature. So if you're making a portrait of a person, maybe within his or her environment, what do you want to include? Do you want just the person, or do you want to make it an environmental portrait with other elements in the frame? Um, what depth of field do you want to use? Do you want just the subject in focus but nothing else, or do you want everything in focus, which directs the viewer's eyes around the frame more? The color temperature, do you want it natural? Do you want it to be daylight? Do you want to have a color cast? All of these things should be, anyway, thought about. And it can get overwhelming, I think. Uh, all the things that you need to think about when making an image. It's like, you know, it can be paralyzing, I suppose, whenever you have to think of too many things just in order to put a plan in action, so to speak. But as happens when learning a sport, for example, eventually they all come together and you don't even have to think about them consciously or very consciously anymore. You do them automatically. But it comes with shooting a lot, and the more you shoot, the more quickly these things get incorporated into the way you shoot and your process of shooting. So when I was younger and in better shape, I used to play a lot of tennis. And when I would incorporate a change into, say, the way I served, for a little while, my serve would fall apart because I'd have to think about that, and then other things wouldn't come right. And it was if, I'd think, oh my God, why did I do that? Now I can't serve at all. But eventually, with practice, I would incorporate that change into my process, and eventually then my serve changed and hopefully improved. But my point is that eventually I didn't think about that thing anymore, and it didn't affect everything else. It just became incorporated into the way I did that, into the way I served, into the way we make images, and so on. So the hope is that all of this technical stuff that we're going over becomes incorporated into us to such a degree that we don't have to, that it's not foremost in our thoughts. We can actively pay much more attention to the subject and what we're shooting, and all of the technical stuff that goes into that we do automatically. Right. Okay, so back to these images. So these we don't need to see. Okay. Any questions? Any questions on white balance and color temperature? Anybody? So our next assignment will deal with white balance and color temperature. So I just want to go over it briefly before we go over to Lightroom. So the third assignment deals with white balance. And here's what I want you to do. Normally, if we were having normal meetings, I'd tell you that if you want to, you can work in groups. I don't know that any of you know each other. We can't meet very easily and still socially distance ourselves. So you're on your own. except for me, of course, for help. But I want you to find these six different lighting situations that I've listed up here. Daylight, outside on a bright sunny day. Incandescent or tungsten light. Fluorescent light, so those two are inside. Cloudy, and if you can't find cloud cover, which you may not in midsummer, you can use shade. And then shade. And finally, flash. And I want you to make 2 images in each of these situations. One with the white balance set to daylight, with one exception. And the second with the white balance set to the type of light under which you're photographing. So ignore the first one, daylight, for a moment, and go to incandescent tungsten light. So inside, maybe in your living room, you'll probably have tungsten or incandescent light, or the equivalent, because as you probably know, light bulbs are being replaced, and the Edison style light bulbs are being phased out or have been phased out, and halogen light bulbs and what are the other ones? Halogens and something else are replacing them, but have the same color temperatures. So presumably they are equivalent. So for the incandescent tungsten section, I want you to go into some place, probably your living room, that has this type of light, and make 2 images. The first with the white balance set to daylight, and the second with the white balance set to incandescent, or maybe your camera says tungsten. And here's what you should see. The daylight white balance image should have an orange color cast, and the image with the white balance set to incandescent should be neutral. You shouldn't see a color cast. And the same for fluorescent. So you possibly have fluorescent light in your bathroom. You may not. Bathrooms, basements, if you have a basement, kitchens, many kitchens use fluorescent light. If you do go shopping, most stores have fluorescent light. How can you tell what it is? Make an image with the white balance set to daylight. And if that image shows a color cast, it will tell you what kind of light it is. So if the color cast is orange, then the lighting situation is incandescent. If the color cast is yellowish green, then the lighting type is fluorescent, right? So, and if the color cast is blue, then the lighting situation is either shade or cloud cover. So again, for fluorescent light, you'll make 1 image with the white balance set to daylight, and the second image with the white balance set to fluorescent. And I want you to do that for each situation, with one exception, and that is photographing outside under daylight. So obviously the lighting situation is daylight, so I don't want you to make 2 daylight white balance images. So for that section, make 1 image with the white balance set to auto, and the second with the white balance set to daylight. Okay. Number 6, flash. So I want you to do that indoors and turn your flash on. So there should be a little button next to the flash that allows you to have it pop up, or somewhere there should be a control that tells the camera to turn the flash on. So turn the flash on for both images, and with the first one, have the white balance set to daylight, and with the second one, have it set to flash. Okay. So 6 sets of images. Again, if you can't find cloud cover, do another set in shade, maybe not quite as deep shade, perhaps. So 6 sets of 2 images. Again, don't, or I didn't say it, don't use the flash except for number 6, which says flash. Also, do not use the auto setting except in number 1 for the daylight section. And as with the other 2 assignments, of course, make a folder entitled with your name, and in that folder, make 6 folders, 1 for each lighting situation. Within those folders, place the appropriate images, and please entitle the images with what you've done. So for example, I don't have the example here, I'll put it in. For example, the images for incandescent, you can say 1 shot at daylight, and the lighting situation is incandescent. And then the second one, white balance, incandescent and incandescent. So you could say daylight incandescent and incandescent, or daylight cloudy for the daylight white balance image, and cloudy for the white balance set to cloudy. It in some way indicate to me which image is which. Okay, so 2 images in each folder, and then of course zip the folder and submit it to Canvas. And that will be due next week. And let me just get the calendar up so I can get the dates. Just a moment. So today's the 23rd, and so we will have that due on, wow, we're almost at the end of the term. How dreadful. Well, dreadful in some ways, just because it went fast. I know everyone is looking forward to the end. So we'll have that due on the 30th in 1 week's time. Okay, and I'll post all of that and put the parameters up. But that is our 3rd assignment. So it's the second to last assignment. And the last assignment will deal with Lightroom and manipulations done in Lightroom. Okay. So the first 3 assignments dealing with the technical camera type stuff. Okay. Any questions? Anybody? Okay, let us spend the rest of our time in Lightroom. Let me just close this stuff out. So Lightroom. Here we are back in Lightroom. And so I've posted some images on Canvas for you guys to work on. And I will post more so that we can kind of work alongside each other, hopefully. Let me just get in here. And down here. All of these Zoom things get in the way. Okay. Just reset those. Okay, so here we are in Lightroom. And again, the library module, which is where I am right now, shows us the images. Our catalog resides here. The collections we've made, smart collections, and so on, reside here. And then when we want to work on the images, we will go, I have to move this thing again. We will go up here and select the develop module. You can also select the develop module by hitting the key letter D, as in develop, and that is one of the very few keystroke commands that actually has a direct relationship to the name. None of the others do. So for example, if you want to go to what's called the loop view, that is looking at a single image, you hit the letter E. How they got that, I don't know. And so on. If you want to go to and crop an image, the letter R, not, anyway. So at any rate, when you do that, if you choose one of the commands that are in the develop module, then it will take you immediately to the develop module. So the develop module is where we work on images, and we can no longer see what's called the grid view, that is all of the images at once. We no longer see the catalog and all these different collections that we've made. You will see the collection that you've chosen the image from. So let's say I choose cobwebs. When I go into the develop module, at the bottom, I can still see this slideshow. If you see this strip of images at the bottom, that is the collection I'm working from, and that will still show in the develop module. But if you want to see all of the other images, you have to go back to the library module. So you can do that by choosing library up here, or the letter G for grid, and that brings us back into that module. So let me go in here, and I'll choose this delightful image of a young woman with red eye. And then we'll talk about being in the develop module. So every module up here, library, develop, map, book, etc., has its own set of controls and instructions. And in the develop module, we have, instead of the catalog and so on, we have these sections. So we have the navigator, and when that's open, the navigator shows us the selected image. Then we have presets, and presets are kind of cool, but I don't want us using these for the assignments, but they give us effects that we would have to manipulate the controls for ourselves. So this isn't the greatest example of an image, but natural, bright, high contrast. So notice if you can see this, as I move the cursor along these presets, I can see a preview of what it will look like. So high contrast in detail, vivid, matte. And then in creative, so those are the color presets. Creative, desaturated, so the colors have been reduced. Cool light, more bluish. Turquoise and red, soft mist. That's truly getting a little frightening. Vintage instant, warm contrast, flat and green. Red lift matte, warm shadows, aged photo. And then in black and white, you have a whole bunch of black and white presets. Landscape, high contrast. Punch, which to me is even higher contrast. So white whites and black blacks. Low contrast, very flat, with few, if any, true whites or true blacks. Flat, soft. Infrared, that's horrific. So mimicking what it would look like if it had been shot with infrared film. Selenium, so in the past, certain toners were used on black and white images, and selenium was one of them, and different papers reacted differently to different toners, but selenium could make some images look a little bluish or purple, or sometimes warmish, with more brown. Sepia tone was used a lot in the 19th century, and that's a very brown toner. Split tone, where you have the highlights and shadows showing different colors. So in this case, the highlights have more brown and the shadows have blue. So those are the presets, and then there are defaults, and you can make your own default settings or use some of Lightroom's. So again, I don't want you to use the presets for assignments, but of course it's fun to play around, and you may end up liking certain ones and saving ones, or using it and then manipulating from there. That's up to you. I'm going to I'm going to skip snapshots for a moment and go to history. And history is really, it's important and it's really cool because it shows everything you've done to an image. So let me just go back here and find an image that I have perhaps worked on a little. I don't know if there are. Oh, I know. So this image I worked on a lot. And not that I'm saying it's the greatest image, but let me go into the develop module. And when it finally comes up, and I don't know why it hasn't, but it's loading. So when it comes up, here it is. If you look to the left under history, you can see that I have done a lot of brush strokes. I've done a lot of stuff to this image, and it just goes on and on and on. And at the very bottom, it will show import. So that's how it was. And as I move my cursor over these different points in history, you can see that the image up in the navigator changes to show what I've done. I can also click on any point in the history. Ooh, that's awful. Like that one. Come on. And it shows you what it looked like at that time, at that point in the process. Finally going and going and going and going and going up to where I ended here. If I want to keep track of these different points without having to go through the entire history, if I think that there are some that are important for some reason, or I liked it at that point. So let me go here. See much change there. Let me go further back. Maybe to this point. And I think, oh, I want to keep track of that so that I don't have to go searching the whole time. Then I can go back up here to snapshots. And I can make a snapshot at any point. So I can click this plus sign, and now a little snapshot window comes up, and the default is the date and time, which is now. And I can say maybe magenta shadows, or some way of identifying that. And I hit create, and now I have this snapshot, magenta shadows, and I can go back to my final, or where I happen to be. And then I think, hey, what did it look like at magenta shadows? And I can just click on that snapshot and see that. And I can do that as many times as I want at as many different points. So this is where I got to in this or on this image, and you can see that I have this huge history of what I've done. I can also, as I said, see collections. That's all I can see from the library module. So I have this history, and I think, wow, I like it at this point.
Can I see the shoes?
Sorry?
Oh, sorry. My
Okay.
mic.
All right, so I like it at this point, but I want to work on it further. But I want to save this, and not just in the snapshots. So I can save a version. And unlike Photoshop, where saving a version means I have to physically save a new copy of that file, I can make what's called a virtual copy. So I go to the pull down menu up at the top under Photo, and about a third of the way down it says Create Virtual Copy. You can also do Command hyphen. Create Virtual Copy, and it will automatically make a copy, and it will automatically show you, be residing on that copy. So now if I go down here to my my little slide view at the bottom, I can see which one is selected, and that is this one here. And if we look here at the name, it says which image it is, and it says copy 1. I haven't actually made a copy on my hard drive. This is just an instruction that's been written into Lightroom so that when I click on it, it will be here. And I can tell that this is the copy without even looking at what it's called, because when I look at the history here on the left, that's all there is. Create virtual copy. And so this is my image at that point. And I might have a momentary panic saying, oh my God, what happened to my history? It's still there. It is with the original. So you see that there are these two images that are the same together in my strip. And when I go back to the original one, now my history is here. So everything I've done to that point is still here. So I would probably leave this one alone, and then if I want to work on the image from this point, go back to the virtual copy and work on that one. But that's a choice that you make. So as I said, I've worked extensively on this image. I can see what it looked like at different points. I can also work side by side with the original if I want to. If I want to see what it looked like originally and then make changes as I go, I can click on the letter Y as in yes. And when I do that, I can see the original and eventually where I am at this point. So you can see that I've done a lot to this image. I've lightened it overall. I really opened up all of the shadows, so you wouldn't even know that there's a cat in the image or what this stuff is in the foreground. So I lightened all of that. I changed some of the color temperatures and emphasized certain areas. So this, if you look all the way to the left, this bright area with the zigzags on it, I brought that down and made it darker and so on. And so these are things that we will do when we work on images. I just wanted to show you, well, the history and so on first, then go to this image. And so everything that I did was done using these controls here on the right. So again, each module has two panels, one on the right, one on the left. And in the develop module, the right-hand panel is where we work, is where the controls are. At the top, there's a histogram, just as we have in the library module. So, sorry. Come on. So in the library module also there's a histogram which shows the distribution of tones and of colors. And then the settings that were used the basic settings. So the ISO, the focal length of the lens, the aperture setting, and the shutter speed. And then back into the develop module, that also is there. And then we have all these tools. So let us talk about these tools. Let me just get down to the collections. And actually, I want to get into another area. Here we go. So let's look at this image. And I'll bring it back into the develop module. And if you look below the histogram, there are these shapes. There's a rectangle and then a circle with an arrow that looks a little bit like the symbol for men. Then a circle with a red dot, a rectangle, vertical rectangle, circle, and then a slider. So these are basic tools for somewhat more, well, for certain types of manipulations. And the first one to the left is called the crop overlay tool. And that is the letter R. And then the next one is the spot removal tool, then the red eye, the graduated filter, the radial filter, and then the adjustment brush. And so these are tools that we use for manipulating certain areas of the frame. Generally, people who work in Photoshop or Lightroom or almost any application have what's called a workflow, an order in which they do things. And so there are things that I do first, for example, and you may or may not decide to do those things, but I just want to go over briefly what those things are. So here on the right, we also have these different sections of tools: basic, tone curve, HSL color, split toning, detail, lens corrections, transform, effects, and calibration. And so the first thing that I do is I go into lens corrections. And I do that for a specific reason. And that reason is to look at these two top instructions. So at the very top, it says profile and manual. And I go into profile, which is the default. And then it says remove chromatic aberration and enable profile corrections. And the first thing I do is click on remove chromatic aberration. And I do that in order to remove, or at least to some degree remove, any colors that don't belong there, that kind of came through as artifacts. So I think I have one image here that does have some chromatic aberration. So let me just come in here for a moment and create a virtual copy and then reset. So this image, as you can see, is really dark, first of all, and the colors are really not accurate. There's a color cast, so it's kind of orangey. And if we look in pretty close, let me just lighten it so that we can see these better. There are all these blobs of color that don't really belong there. And so by clicking on remove chromatic aberration, some of those, not the big blobs, but some things, especially lines of color along areas that have borders, you know, a change from one area to another, one color to another, those will be reduced. To deal with all the rest of the noise, we have to do something else. But at any rate, the first thing that I do is go in and remove chromatic aberration, so that whatever can be done automatically is already done. Because if I work on the image and then click chromatic aberration, then that will change the work that I've already done. So I do that initially. I can also, let me go back here and back to this image. Click on Enable Profile Corrections. And what that does is it looks into Lightroom's vast catalog of information about different cameras and lenses, and takes into account things that the lens and or camera do, mostly the lens in this case, things that that particular lens do, those things that the lens does, that may change the image. So it can be very subtle. So if you look at, this is the image as it was shot, and when I click on Enable Profile Corrections, it's as if it warped a little, went, and the shadows opened up a little bit. The shadows at the edges of the frame opened up a little bit. So apparently the lens I used, whatever this one is, and you can see that there's this vast list of just of Nikon lenses. So I used apparently an 18-55 lens. Excuse me, this particular Nikon 18-55 lens. I didn't even remember I had an 18-55, but anyway, there you have it. And it looked at the information about that lens and said, oh, this lens is known to do this kind of distortion, so we'll correct for it. And so the vast majority of lenses that are used are profiled here, and you can do that. Now, I have to say, I often forget to do that. And then if I go back in later and correct for it, then it doesn't look quite right after I've done work. So these are things to do initially if you're going to do them. And I definitely recommend that you remove chromatic aberration. It's up to you whether you want to enable the profile corrections. Okay, so that is the first thing I do. I go into the lens corrections section here, and I deal with that. I also, if the image is very noticeably too light or too dark, I'll make a kind of gross adjustment just so I can see it and know what I want to work on in terms of the composition, which comes next, or the framing. And so I look at it and ask myself if I want to crop this at all. And my general recommendation when shooting is to try and shoot what you want to be in the frame. So if you're concerned just with this, this clothes rack, the drying rack here, maybe you don't want any of the rest of this information, and you know that at the time, so come in closer, orient the camera vertically, or whatever. That said, I may want to crop it after the fact. And so this, this control up at the top, just below the histogram, to the left is the cropping tool. It's called, again, the crop overlay tool. And if you click on it or use, as it says here, the letter R, that will activate that tool. And now a grid comes up, and I can move it around to change this, you know, the composition and how much information there is. I can use the move tool, so that's the little hand, to move that around within my selection. I can also change the angle, so if I move the cursor out of the selected area to a corner, I now get this curved double arrow, and I can rotate the frame if I want to, like so. When I am happy with what I've done, I can either click return or click on the tool icon again, or go down here to the lower right where it says done. And now what I've done is what I see. But it's not written in stone. I can look at it and think, oh my God, there was an earthquake and it jerked my hand and now everything's crooked. So I can just go back into that tool and see the original image and what I've done, and I can redo it. I can also click reset down here in the lower right if I don't want any of that. But when I click reset, notice it got darker again. So everything was reset. If I don't want that, I can go into my history and go back to the last point that I was at which I was, before I did those manipulations in the cropping tool. And so now I've done that. If you look at the history, I've gone back to where it says exposure. And with the if I move my cursor over the rest of the history above that, I can see what I did, and I can go back to one of those points or just go back to this point before I did any of that. Now, if I go back to this point and then continue to work, these instructions will disappear. So that is the only time the history disappears, whether you want it to or not. So if you go back in history and then continue to work from that point, then your other reality disappears and you create a new reality, so to speak. So now if I go back into this and do something completely different, now the rest of that history has disappeared and I just have one that says crop rectangle. If I think to myself, oh my God, what have I done? I didn't want to do that. If I haven't worked beyond that first step, I can do an undo. And so an undo on Macs is Command Z. I think that on PCs it's Control Z, or you can go up to the pull down menu under Edit and select the first thing that is undo crop rectangle. And now that old history comes back. Okay, so I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, well, I don't think I really need to crop too much. Maybe it's a little bit, there's a little bit too much at the top. Maybe it pulls my eyes up a little bit too much. So I could maybe come down a little bit like so and maybe pull the edge in a little bit more. But I don't need a gross cropping, I don't think. And I certainly don't really need to do that goofy thing I did before. So if I'm happy with that, great. I can hit return or done or click on the rectangle, and then I have this new crop. And again, if I don't like it, I can go back in and redo it. Okay. So that's this first the first little tool up here at the top, the cropping tool or crop overlay. The second is called the spot removal tool. And this isn't, well, this will work. So for those of you who have worked in Photoshop, you know that Photoshop has the clone tool and the healing tool or healing brush. And these tools allow you to select an area, specific area in the frame, and replace it with information from another part of the frame. The cloning tool replaces it with the exact information, and so you can repeat it over and over or just repeat one thing from a part of the frame into another. The healing tool takes that information but then kind of blends it into what's there. So the healing tool is really good for pieces of dust, little blobs that either don't belong there or don't look right for whatever reason. So let me just go to an image that I think works a little better for this. And so we'll go back to this image. So let me show you what the cloning tool does first. So you have these choices. When you click on the spot removal icon under the histogram, this window opens up and it says brush and then clone or heal, and you choose what you want to do. So right now I'm choosing clone, and then below that there are these sliders. The first one, size, is for the size of your brush. So if you look at the cursor on the image that I have, I'm making it larger and smaller. I'm working on a laptop, so I can use the trackpad to make it larger and smaller. If you're using a mouse, you can use the wheel on it if you have a wheel. You can also use this slider to make it larger and smaller. And just to give you more options, you can also use the bracket buttons or keys on the keyboard. So the left bracket makes the cursor smaller and the right bracket makes it larger. Whichever you like to use is up to you. Below that is opacity, and that is how opaque, I guess, you want your selection to be. Do you want to be able to see some of the original background through it or not? And so if you're at 100% opacity, you'll not see any of the original background. But if you put it lower than that, then you'll see some of it. So let me just come in closer here. And I'm going to select this, this little art thing on the wall, the Ganesh elephant, like this. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. So if you make a selection and you don't like it, you can either move it, like so, or you can just hit the delete key and it just disappears. So let's say, I hate that. So let's say I want to copy this this art, this wall hanging, and make a second one. I select the area that I want it to go to, and then I select what I want to go there, what I want there. So I have done that. Now I can see my selection of the area is not great because the background isn't the same. And so I have this halo around it that I don't like, which I can deal with later on, or I can just start over, which I will probably do. But I can also move this around to wherever I want it. If I move this one, then the selection changes, right? So generally I want to keep that where it is, but I can move this around. And if I don't like it, again, I can just hit delete and then maybe make new area. Like so. Maybe put them side by side, whatever. If I want to see, let's say put it here, but I want to see part of that Tutankhamun mask, death mask below it, I can change the opacity. So now with that slider moving, see down at 0, of course, I can see nothing of the overlay, but as I increase the opacity, I can see more and more of my overlay. And I could do that wherever. I mean, I could bring that down here over the woman's face and screw around like that if I want to. And again, if I don't like it, which I don't, I can just hit delete and get rid of it and do it somewhere else. So that is the clone portion of this tool. The healing portion allows me to get rid of like little blobs. So for example, this blob here or here, there are a whole bunch of little things that I may not like that I would like to get rid of. So the controls are the same. I go to heal. Now I click on heal instead of clone. And, oh, I forgot feather. So I choose an area and select that. And now the second circle that shows up is what I will be using to replace the original. So generally, especially with spots, I want to get it to as close to the spot point as possible so that the background doesn't look different. I also want to bring the size of the brush down to contain as little information around that spot as possible, unless I want that replaced as well. If you look at the cursor, especially when I make it bigger, you can see it better. Notice that there are two circles. And that shows you two things, obviously. The center circle, the inner circle, shows the area that's selected. And then the outer circle shows what's called the feathering. And the feathering selects a certain amount of information around that inner circle to be partially affected. So if you have no feathering, let me do this, you will have a hard line around your selection. If you have, oops, do it first. If I put the feathering up at 100, notice now that the outer circle is much larger. So that means that that area around my selection will also be selected for, but not as a hard line. So here you can see that it's blurry around the edges. So again, the center area is what was selected for, and then it kind of falls off at the edges when you increase the feathering. Usually for the healing, especially, usually for most things, you'll probably want at least some feathering because you usually don't want that hard line. So we can get rid of that. You may not want it at 100%. I think the default is 50. That's fine. For spots, you usually want the opacity up at 100%. So let me select that. And now, oops, I'll just bring this in to wherever I think looks closest to the background while getting rid of that that spot. And so now I have gotten rid of it. And I can do that for any number of areas. So if I go to the navigator window here, I can move around the selector and find other areas that I might want to change. So I can see here there are several, oops, haha, and I didn't want to do that. I can see a spot over here that I might want to get rid of. So I'll select that and then move the selector around till I get something that's pretty close. And you can see the information in the original circle changing as I move the secondary circle around. And so when I click on that and make a selection, then the original selection is filled with the secondary one. And what the healing tool does is it blends that in, hopefully, pretty seamlessly, so it disappears. Again, the clone tool copies something directly, and you can do that for spots, but usually the healing tool works better because it actively blends in to the surrounding area. And even if it's not like a dust spot or something that doesn't belong there, let's say it's something that is there but you don't want there, you can make that disappear too. So let's say have this, looks like a, I don't know, piece of thread or something. Let's say don't like it and I want to get rid of it. That's a little harder to do working in this limited space of information. But let's give that a try. Well, it's okay. It's not great. I can also do it in pieces. So maybe I just want to select one area first and fill that. And then this area and fill that. So in that way, it becomes easier to deal with doing it in pieces. Note that these selected areas have a dot, the center with a black dot in it. That means that's the active selection. But notice that there's a gray spot over here. That is the thing I just did that is now inactive. But if I click on it, it now becomes the active spot. Okay, and there should be one up here. Over here as well is one that I made. Okay, now with the healing tool, it doesn't have the same activity, you might say, or reactivity. So you can just go back in and change what you've done without reactivating it. It just kind of stays active. With the with this area here, when I make specific changes, I have to reactivate what I've done. Okay. So that is the spot overlay tool. It's very useful, I find. And generally in Lightroom, we use Lightroom to do corrective things rather than creative things. We do the creative changes more in Photoshop, that is bringing in other images and so on. So in terms of repeating this thing over and over again, I can do that in Lightroom easily. But for more advanced stuff of that sort, I would probably do it in Photoshop. And you can move images between Lightroom and Photoshop very easily. So if I want to, I get to a certain point with my image in Lightroom, and then I want to work on it in, excuse me, in another application, for example, Lightroom, I can easily pull it into Lightroom. So under the photo pull down menu, if I go to edit in, I can choose to pull it over into Adobe Photoshop or another application, which I would have to select, from my list of applications. But I can pull it directly into Photoshop if I want to. okay, at any point. And then I can bring it back into Lightroom. Okay, so those are the first two tools here under the histogram in the develop module. Any questions? Anybody? No? Okay. Well, these images are available to you to work on. They are available in Canvas in the modules area, in the modules section. There's a module with images in it. And so I hope that you will follow along next time and work as I work on images so that you can do the same things as I'm doing them. And of course, hopefully you'll be working on your own images as well. Right. So, any questions? Nothing? I think some of you have disappeared, but oh well. Okay, well, if there are no questions, that is it for today. As always, the recording will be posted on, recording of this Zoom meeting will be posted on Canvas relatively soon. So if you haven't turned in the depth of field assignment yet, please do so sooner rather than later. If you have any questions about it, let me know. And start working on the white balance assignment. And if you have any questions on that, let me know. Other than that, have a delightful and safe rest of the week and weekend, and see you on Tuesday. Okay, take care. Bye.